Good evening, everyone. I'm Kathleen Spring, the superintendent here at Mohonasen, and I'd like to welcome you to our annual budget hearing, where we'll have a chance to hear about our budget as well as meet the candidates. We have 4 candidates running for 2 seats. I'd like to talk a little bit about the structure of tonight for you so that you know how this will play out. For the first 20 minutes, approximately, we'll do a budget presentation. Mr. Chris Roberti, our Assistant Superintendent for Business, will come up and do the budget presentation. And then we'll transition into the Meet the Candidates portion of the evening, and that'll be about an hour long. We'll have some structured questions. We will also have an opportunity for people to submit questions if they'd like to. There are index cards. Where are they? In the back of the room, Karen? In the back of the room. And people can submit those. I would ask that you submit those by the end of the budget presentation to Mrs. Cutting, who's waving her hand right here, so that we can look at those and try to organize them in groups of similar questions. We are videotaping this presentation so that we can post it on our website, so that anyone that wasn't able to make it here this evening can view it at their leisure. The other thing that I would say, let me see what my notes said. The question, when people get up there to do their presentation, because we're recording, and I think Mrs. Nerney, our communications specialist, will talk about this too, our microphones are very sensitive, so if you're a nervous person like I am and have to do something with your hands and you rattle paper, we'll hear that on the video. So I'd ask you to be careful about that. So let me move into the budget portion of the evening. We are going to talk, Mr. Roberti is going to talk about our budget. We're very excited this year that it's a positive budget situation, which it has not really been in the past 6 or 7 years. We're adding back positions and we're starting to rebuild our programs. And so to kick off the budget presentation, we'd like to show a short video clip that Mrs. Nerney created.
All right. So Karen, thank you very much for that video. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over some of the high points of the budget. What we try to do with the budget hearing, throughout the process, we've gone through each component of the budget over the last couple of months. Every board meeting, there's been a budget presentation. But in the final one here, we're really looking to do a recap of all of that. Look at some of the big picture items and address a few of the different major points that have either had big changes in the budget or that have influenced some of the decisions that we've made. So to start off with, and some of this information you saw in that video, but as far as the big picture look at it, we have a $48.3 million budget that we're looking at putting on the ballot for next week. That increase is about $362,000 from last year. So the actual percentage increase in the budget is about 0.75%. It's 0.76%. And what that ends up being as far as the tax levy increase, which is obviously one of the most important pieces kind of this process, is about a $555,000 tax levy increase, which is 2.21%. That is right at the tax levy cap calculation that we have. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we move on as to how that's calculated and what thought process went into making some of the decisions that resulted in that tax levy. The most important thing for the community to know, and one of the reasons that we stay within that limit, is that when you go out with the tax levy limit within that set amount, that you only need a simple majority, which is essentially 50% of the vote plus one vote. So that makes a big difference. If you exceed, or they call pierce the cap, then you need 60%, which is considered a supermajority, in order to pass the budget. So that's kind of an important concept to remember as we walk through this. So some of the staffing increases that we're looking at for the budget for next year, as Dr. Spring alluded to, we did get some additional revenues from the state. The GEA was eliminated. We got some extra foundation aid, and we'll go into some more detail with those in a minute. And what we did was we used that to address some of the issues that have happened over the past several years when we've had a decrease in those items. So you'll see on the left side of the presentation there that the instructional staff that we have, and really what that's doing is it's addressing class sizes and some program needs that we have. The non-instructional side, over on the right side, that right column, generally those non-instructional pieces are all a result of the Center for Advanced Technology. Other than a small portion of making a part-time position full-time in the business office, those are a majority for the Center for Advanced Technology and basically the day-to-day operations and getting that building up and running. So as far as the staffing increases that we have, those are the two major categories. And again, they're priorities that the district has as far as trying to reduce class size and address some programs. As far as program pieces on the left side, one of the things on there being a technology teacher, and that's really to help foster some of the feeder programs that will eventually end up with students going into the CAT building, the new advanced technology building, for some of their programs. So if we look at those class sizes, you'll see the way that these columns are set up, you'll see that we have this year's enrollment, number of sections and average class size, and then we have the projections for next year. One of the important things to look at with the projections for next year is that we do have certain grade levels where we're estimating that they will go up. And some of those grade levels would be like when somebody goes from 5th to 6th grade. And one of the things that we see is we see some enrollment come from private and parochial schools when they start to hit those middle school grades. So there is, some of this is assumptions that we need to make, and a lot of it's just based on our current enrollment. One of the big things that drove some of the class sizes and some of the staffing that we needed to do was the significant increase that we're looking at in kindergarten. So if you take a look at that chart, you'll see that we expect kindergarten to go up about 55 students from this year to next year. So that resulted in a few different things that you're going to see in the budget. One would be just the teachers to teach those sections, those additional sections, and also some increases based on transportation needs for those students. So if you look across, though, at the very last column of average class size that we're estimating for 2016-17, one of the things that we've tried to do is keep them consistent as possible in the K-5 area. And you'll see, and again, these are all projections, that they all fall in that 21 to 22 range, which was a major goal of the board to try to bring some of those class sizes down. The ones that you see for the average class size in 15-16 are even a little bit lower than they've been in prior years. So we've been on this kind of nice ability to continue to lower class sizes to what we would like to see. And going into next year, that 21 to 22 in those elementary grade levels are definitely an important factor. You'll see that sixth grade is at 25. That's one of the grade levels where we're estimating that 7 or 8 student increase even from what we currently have in fifth grade. If those students don't end up coming from the parochial schools, obviously that could change that number. If those students don't end up coming in or we see a slight decrease, that class size could end up in that 23 to 24 range too, because right now, if you look, there's only 7 sections of that. So that's a major focus of the district. It was a large discussion at one of our public meetings to kind of talk about what we were going to do with some of the resources that we had, and addressing class size was a huge factor. So if we look at the expenses, and the way that we like to do this is to break it down in the categories that you see there and really compare it from the current budget year 15-16 to the 16-17 budget year. One of the things that we like to see on here is that, the biggest increase that we have is in instruction. And the reason that I say we like to see that is that means that it's going toward the students, kind of their daily activities. When you think about instruction, it's everything that has to do with kids kind of during the day. It's teachers and it's guidance counselors and it's sports programs and the nurses and everything that goes along with that daily life of a student. So some of those staffing increases that you saw are what's resulting in that increase in that budgetary amount. That along with the general contractual increases that would happen from year to year. One of the things that's atypical this year, although the last couple of years it's been one of the things that's helped us with budget, is that you see that there's not a massive increase in employee benefits. And, there was a time where both the retirement systems, health insurance, were really skyrocketing, and this was eating up huge portions of the budget as we move forward. So you see it's almost flat from last year into next year. And, that's certainly something that allowed us to, again, allocate those funds in a way that could really benefit students. Operations and maintenance. There's the increases there are both contractual and some of the additional staff, equipment, and supplies that we're going to need for the new building. So that's kind of a direct relationship to what we have going on with our current capital project. Same thing with transportation. The increases there are generally contractual and also adding a couple of runs for the elementary, the anticipated increase in the elementary enrollment. After that, one of the things that would really stick out to you is if you look at that debt service amount and you see this massive change of almost $800,000 as a decrease in debt service. And that seems odd because we have a capital project going on and obviously there's a cost to the capital project. But what's happening is as we have some of the money coming on in both bond anticipation notes and in some permanent bonds, we also had a lot of money coming off of old debt. So some old projects that the district did that dropped off that we no longer have to pay on. So the actual net effect of all of our capital expenses going into 2016-17 is almost an $800,000 decrease. So that seems great on the expense side, but as we slide over and look at some of the revenues, if you look at that top line of state aid, that's where you're going to see the other side of debt. So we have all this debt that's coming off, but we also have corresponding aid that we get from the state that's coming off as well. So we have that almost $800,000 that we don't have to pay anymore. But if you look at our state aid, and this is where kind of public reports about state aid can be deceiving because it looks like we're losing $670,000 in state aid. And while technically that's true, because we're losing the debt that goes along with it, what we really want to look at is the other parts, which is, as it was very well documented, the GEA went away. And that gave us about $660,000 in additional aid by the GEA being restored. We also received about $75,000 in foundation aid as an increase. So we actually did well with state aid overall, even though, like I said, on the surface, you look and see that there's $670,000 decrease. So that's kind of an important concept to remember. Other things were relatively flat. The couple that I want to point out are the BOCES rental. And there's a couple of factors working in that BOCES rental number. We have an increase, which is, if people remember back from when we went out to vote for the capital project, one of the things that we looked at was making sure that we could rent that space and be collaborative with some of the other organizations that's out there. And BOCES was one of those. So we're estimating, and we haven't gotten to the final number with them yet, but we're estimating about $250,000 in revenue from renting out some of the classrooms to BOCES. And the reason that it's not going up $250,000 is we also have a slight decrease of the other classrooms that BOCES has rented over time with us. So there are rental and ancillary fees that we get from BOCES every year. Those are going down a little bit, but the rental from the Center for Advanced Technology is going up. So the net effect of those two together is that $186,000. The $200,000 that you see increased in an interfund transfer is also really important because that was another major decision that the board made to stay in line with what the capital project was put out there as. And what it is that's from our debt service account. That's $200,000 from our debt service account. And when we talked about going out from the project, we knew as this debt came on that we didn't want to just pass that along to the taxpayers. We knew that we wanted to be able to offset that with our debt service account. And this $200,000 has allowed that tax levy calculation to be that 2.21%. Without it, it would have been up at 3% and had a more significant impact on the taxpayers. So one of the things that the board decided to do was to allocate that money, bring that money in, and decrease what our tax levy calculation would be, which is that 2.21%. The other revenues stayed relatively similar, except for the fact that we have another $50,000 allocated there that we believe will end up being a rental fee in the new building for a local community college to run some night programs there. So again, that's not finalized, but that's our best estimate as to what that might look like moving forward. And you'll see when you total this side up, the change is at $362,000, and on the previous slide, the same thing, that $362,000. So obviously, that's how you end up with a balanced budget, that the expenses are going up the same amount as the revenues. So this is just a slightly different way to look at it, and this is something that's in the budget newsletter that everybody will receive if you haven't already. And it's called the three-part budget. And basically in the three-part budget, they just break it down into different components, and it's one of the ways that we have to report out on the budget. So the program piece, similar to the idea of the instructional, except it also starts to add in and allocate some of the employee benefits to that component as well. So the program component doesn't only include the salaries of all the instructional personnel, but also their benefits. So as you look through that, the program is 75% of the budget, which is, again, what we like to see because that's what directly impacts kids. Capital is all of the capital debt, the operations and maintenance, those types of things. And then administration, it includes all administrative staff, but also the business office, all of our legal fees, all the school board costs, and a majority of other items that fall under administration are more of kind of like that day-to-day that don't happen in the buildings and isn't really that operations piece. So you'll see that that's at about 11% of the budget. So this is the tax levy calculation and the way that we need to do it. There's a few factors that I want to point out to you. And the major ones are the growth factors. And so if you look at the second number down, which is the tax-based growth factor, you'll see that it's 1.006. And that's specific to Mohonasen. So every school district gets a growth factor that they use to estimate basically the growth in the district of your tax base expanding. So even if everybody paid the same amount of taxes, the community grew by this amount, so you would be able to increase your levy by that amount. So if you went from 9 taxpayers to 10, and you wanted to levy the same amount per taxpayer, you would obviously then be increasing by that 10th person. So we have this, it doesn't seem like a lot, but it's 0.6% increase. It's actually, in the middle to high end of some of the places in our area. And what it actually ends up being as an increase in the levy is about $150,000. So that's our local factor. When you look at the statewide factor, which got proposed a few years back and kind of promoted as a 2%, that's actually 0.12%. So that's the one that's the allowable levy growth factor, the lesser of 2% or the CPI. And since the CPI was 0.12 this year, that's the increase from kind of the statewide level. That increase for our district is about $30,000. So you can see where that's kind of gone awry as far as what it was initially promoted as and kind of where we've ended up as the CPI has shrunk. So the combination of those two growth factors is about $180,000. And then what we do after that is to look at what the exclusions are in the upcoming year. And for us, the only exclusion that we have, which is an additional piece that goes on top of those growth factors, the opportunities for exclusions are the retirement systems. Generally, if you have any really large court cases pending, which luckily we don't, and then the capital costs. So for us, it's capital costs. Like I said before, the retirement systems have actually gone down, so there's no exclusion there. But when we look at our capital costs, after the $200,000 offset, that's where you get that $752,000 number for the coming year exclusions. So you're able to levy the coming year exclusions minus the prior year exclusions, where if you look up that chart a little bit, it was $377,000. So between the two growth factors and our exclusions, that's where you end up with this final number at the bottom, which is that $25,744,000. And that ends up being a 2.21% increase on the levy. So I know that's a lot of numbers kind of flying around. I think the most important things to bring from it, though, are the idea that, again, it would have been more like $25.944 million if the board hadn't allocated that $200,000 from debt service and bring that number down. And so, again, what does that mean to the public is one of the most important things. So here's a chart that kind of shows our 3 towns that our community is made up of. And if you look at the column all the way to the right, what we try to do is, and there are factors that could certainly change this. And, if somebody's house assessment changes, if the equalization rate for an individual town changes, it will impact these numbers. But based on what we know right now, that 2.21% levy for somebody who owns a house that's worth $150,000 is about $57. So that's our best estimate right now before we get these other factors that we'll get later on from the towns, that it's about a $57 increase in taxes for 16-17 with that 2.21% levy. Tax rebates. So we've had these kind of things going on in the past few years. We're staying within your tax levy limit calculation, included some of the tax freeze and some of the cooperative things that we needed to do and efficiency plans with other districts. This year, the way that that's going to work is there's a potential rebate of $185 for homeowners. The checks are planned to be mailed by October 31st. And the criteria to get those checks are that you have to be a house that's receiving a STAR exemption, not just be eligible for it, but actually receiving it. Have a household income of under $200,000. Your district has to be tax cap compliant, and this is where it comes into play, the fact that we've always been within the cap. We had a good efficiency plan that was approved by the state, so we've done that piece of it as a district. And the rebate can't be greater than the tax bill. So for somebody else that might have a bunch of other exemptions already, they just can't get back $185 in taxes if they're paying $100 in taxes. So at that point, it would max out at the $100 that person is paying. So this is, it's a nice offset for people. They're going to pay their taxes first and then get this back. But this is the rebate that's available this year. The other thing that will be on the ballot next week, we'll have 3 things. We'll have the main budget. We'll have this proposition for buses, and then obviously the election of the board candidates, who you're going to hear from in a few minutes. So the one that we put on the ballot this year is for 5 full-size 66-passenger buses. Now, typically when we do this, it's because we have buses that we absolutely need to get rid of because they're costing so much to run. Based on what I said before about that kindergarten enrollment going up, we actually plan on purchasing 5 new buses, but actually only trading in 3 buses. We're going to still need to keep 2 of them and actually expand the fleet a little bit to meet the needs of those elementary students that we believe will be coming to the district in September. So you see the total cost there, and one of the things that we've discussed about this in the past is what the actual cost is after state aid and over the course of 5 years. And another important concept is to remember that we have this series of 5-year bus bonds. And so every year when we have a new bond come on, we also have one come off. So as we look at the ones that will be coming off in the future, we estimate that on the budget itself, which will actually hit in the 17-18 budget year, that the purchase of these buses will be about $10,000. So the difference between the bond coming off and the bond coming on for these buses would be about $10,000. So the contingent budget rules. Again, this is something we've gone over several times, but it's important to remember that the dollar amount that we're talking about when we talk about contingent budget is that levy increase, that $550,000. But it also has a bunch of other restrictions that have to go with it. And one of the things I'd bring up in this year is that the equipment purchases that are not being able to be made under a contingency budget. And there's a lot of equipment purchases that are going to be necessary to run the new buildings and to clean the new buildings. And so obviously not only from a dollar perspective, but also from a functional perspective, a contingency budget would be a very difficult thing to handle this particular year. So the way that those basically work, though, is that if the budget gets voted down the initial time, the board can make a decision to go out with the same budget again. They could go out with an amended budget, or they can just choose to go to contingency. So, luckily we haven't been in that situation before, and it's one of the reasons that we try to, put out reasonable tax increases, stay within the levy, and I'll go back to that $200,000 again, just because I think it's important to try to make it as palatable as possible in this economy for taxpayers. But it's an important thing to remember about the contingent budget rules. The other thing we're here for tonight, and we'll get to in just a second, we do have 2 vacancies on the board coming up for next year. We have 4 people running for those seats, and you'll get to meet them in just a minute, but we have Heather Quinn, Gary Spadero, Deborah Escobar, and Robert Piccirillo. And that's the way their names are going to be on the ballot, so that's why we have them in that order. They run for 3-year terms that will start this July 1st, 2016. There's some information about each candidate. You'll obviously hear from them tonight, but you will also get some information in the mail as well, in our budget brochure. Any questions from anybody? Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've been paying taxes for Rockingham for 43 years, and I've very seldom seen the budget actually be flat or go down for school tax. And, you know, as a senior citizen, our social security, we got a 0 raise for this year. Plus, you know, every time the school budget comes up, it's like a cash cow. They want money. Has anybody ever negotiated with the teachers' union on these healthcare benefits and retirement benefits like we did in our time, the cuts we had to make the sacrifice? You can't keep giving these people the money they want. You're gonna have to be realistic. They're gonna have to pay their share to have this healthcare and retirements. You can't give what they want all the time.
No, and we do know, and the district knows that, and the Teachers Association actually also knows that. I mean, that is one of the things that I can tell you in recent years, all of the bargaining units have actually given back and paid a higher percentage of their health care costs. So it's one of the things that we have looked at and tried to, really control those costs as much as possible. And all of the bargaining units over the last 3 or 4 years now have given back money toward health care and pay a higher percentage than they used to.
Okay, next question.
Yep.
Put on 20 more positions. That's gonna increase your healthcare costs more.
Correct. Yep.
Well, that's the thing. Because I'm looking at that portion in your pie chart over here, and the proposed, the healthcare is gonna go up. I don't know by how much, but, I don't know if you got those 20 employees figured in there.
Well, we don't know, not every employee takes health care. We have several that don't. And that's another thing that we've actually been working on our bargaining units with, and was part of what we did with our Teachers Association is to look at the potential for a buyout if people do not, if a certain number of people do not take health care benefits. So it would benefit both the employee and the district by having less people take health care through the district, reduce those health care costs, and then be a small buyout to the employee as a benefit to that. So those are, they're great points to bring up, and they're things that we struggle with all the time. And try to balance those with, giving the kids the best education that we can. So it is difficult, but I will say, I think both administratively and from all of the employees that we have, is that we do recognize that, and it's been a topic of conversation with our unions. And we're also part of consortiums for a lot of these costs, and we're able to keep them down way more than places that aren't. Like for healthcare, we're part of CASHIC, which is a capital area school health insurance consortium, and we're really able to keep our expenses as low as anybody in the region with those increases by being a part of this larger group. And we're looking at some creative things with them to try to keep those costs down. So I completely understand what you're saying, because that's not where we want to pay our money to either. And we feel like we have gotten good buy-in from the employees with it.
Education comes first.
Yep. So thank you.
Thank you.
So just as far as kind of that next step, a week from tomorrow is the actual vote, where you vote on both the budget, the bus propositions, and for the board candidates. So just a reminder about voter eligibility: you have to be in the district at least 30 days prior to the budget vote. And we do have absentee ballots currently available in the district office if there's somebody who can't, for whatever the reason might be, illness, disability, out of town, if they need to do absentee ballots. Okay. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, we're going to take a few-minute break to transition to the Meet the Candidates portion of the evening. Thanks.